Hey guys, this is Raymond, and today we're going to talk a little bit about empty hands in FMA or Filipino martial arts. Right? So this is a part of Filipino martial arts, and everybody I think who's spent any amount of time training Filipino martial arts would know that FMA has an empty hands component or an unarmed component, right? So FMA isn't just about sticks, isn't just about knives and swords. There's an empty hand component to it, an unarmed component to it. But what I and a lot of practitioners that I know try to emphasize this point, right? Um, you know, Anyone who's done any kind of workshop or any kind of public training or demonstration, one of the most common things you will always hear is, "What do you do if you don't have your weapon?" Right? And I've heard that. Like, a lot of you guys have probably heard that. So a lot of Filipino martial arts practitioners have been trying to show this aspect of Filipino martial arts, of our arts, right? Um, you know, but what I think has happened is some people have kind of overcorrected or overshot the point. Where I think some people are kind of overstating how good Filipino martial arts is when it comes to unarmed combat, right? Um, Now, what got me to think about this? Imagine a situation, right, where you have an empty hands competition, right, an unarmed competition. Like, let's say, for example, um, MMA, right? Everybody's doing MMA these days. Um, if you listen to some Filipino martial arts practitioners, you would think that FMA empty hands would work perfectly well in an MMA environment. And I think that's a bit too much to claim. For me, that's like finding a judoka or someone or a karateka, or yeah, let's work with karate. Karate has weapons, right? It's just like saying someone who has been training with karate weapons can go and fight in an FMA or Filipino martial arts competition and would be a perfect fit for that. That's overstating the point, right? I think everyone would agree that doesn't sound like it's something that will happen, right? Um, so one of the things I think that people are kind of missing is the context in which Filipino martial arts unarmed component is typically trained or used, right? So, um, what I mean is, anyone who's trained Filipino martial arts, most Filipino martial arts would start with the weapons, and then as you progress, at the end of it, you'll be using bare hands, right? The idea is a human being is a tool using animal, right? Is a tool using being, and it's more natural for us to fight with tools than it is to fight without tools, right? That's why that's the progression. You start with the more natural, where you pick up a stone, you pick up a stick, something, right? All the way to the most unnatural, which is trying to beat up another human being with just your fists. Very unnatural, right? So that's the progression, right? So a lot of the Filipino martial artists who would get into empty hands or unarmed fighting have a lot of background, all right, when it comes to fighting already. They have all the attributes that would make you a successful martial artist. The ability to gauge range, timing, all of that good stuff, right? Mm, and another context is, as I mentioned, Filipino martial arts is primarily an armed martial art. So the way I see Filipino martial arts empty hand is it's a swordsman trying, or it's a, yeah, let's work with swordsman, all right? It's like a swordsman trying to fight like a boxer, but doesn't have the time to train like a boxer, right? What do I mean? To expound a little bit, right? If you've been training like a boxer, or like, since we're talking about karate people, karateka, There's a lot of hand conditioning going on. There's a lot of physical conditioning going on. There's a lot of things going on that are unnecessary in armed combat, or it's not as emphasized in armed combat. While there are certain things in armed combat that doesn't matter half as much in unarmed fighting, right? It works both ways. So my point is, I had a point. Right. So Filipino martial artists are basically the if we're fighting unarmed, it's basically us in an emergency situation where, as I mentioned, we believe it's more natural to be armed than unarmed, right? Like, if any of you, another example that a friend of mine likes to use is, if people get into a fight outside in a bar or whatever, it's actually very unnatural to people for people to start punching. A lot of people would pick up a chair and hit another person with it or throw the chair. If you've ever seen any kind of group fights online, with CCTV videos, you see a lot of people will pick up something and use it as a weapon. So a Filipino martial artist fighting unarmed is actually a guy in an emergency, right? This is a guy in a self-defense situation where he just has no access to weapons at all. Or, for example, the attack came so suddenly, there's no time to access his weapon, right? That's what I see, right? And again, this isn't our focus. In my experience, Filipino martial artists, this isn't our focus. We focus with the weapons because we believe that's more important. I mean, take that how you will. So there, that's what happens. And when you focus on something, right, that's what you get good at. Now, people confuse self-defense situations with sporting events or sparring, right? I don't know. Well, I can kind of understand what's happening, why they're getting confused, but most of the time it's not that important. But this time I think it is. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that I believe that Filipino martial arts, the unarmed aspect of Filipino martial arts, is very good. It's very serviceable in a self-defense situation, right? These are situations where you have to protect yourself. It's kind of a emergency, life and death kind of thing. It's definitely not a sporting situation. It's not like a boxing match. It's not like even stick fight that we have. The sporty kind of stick fights that we have in Filipino martial arts. It's definitely not that at all. It's, as I mentioned, a Filipino martial artist is a guy who's fighting empty hand, is a guy in an emergency situation, right? Um, so that's not our focus at all, and that's not where our sports focus. So why is it important that our that you know the distinction that I'm making between sports and self-defense? When you turn something into a game, into a sport, I don't know if there's a term for it, but it takes a life of its own, right? And people have a tendency to just hyper focus on the attributes that really help you win. And this is something that's kind of subconscious. I think and I've seen it time and again where people would um, think outside the box, as it were. Like, people always talk about thinking outside the box. But these are people in sports. These are people who are trying to game the system. People who are trying to find an advantage that nobody really saw. But it's within the system, but it's kind of playing around the edges of it. And these are the really good competitors, right? These are the competitors who look for the little edge that they have. And when you get to a certain level in sports or competition, the fight isn't about the number of techniques that you know, because it is a sport, so the techniques do get limited, right? Not everything is available to everyone. Typically, it's a balance, right? They allow enough techniques so that it's interesting. There's a lot of flexibility, a lot of different ways to win, but they restrict the number of techniques as well to make sure that the players, the competitors, are safe, right? And that narrows the skill of the competitors, right? And it narrows it in a good way, I think. Like it focuses it like a laser. So anyone who's competed in competition, like you know, padded stick competition, even live stick competition, these people have very very good attributes that are being highlighted in each event. Like for example, people in the padded stick competitions, a lot of them are great at timing, at distance, right? Because that's what is being highlighted in that format, right? Not so much with endurance, right? The guys who fight in live stick competition, like Wekaf style, they have impressive endurance. Like I am seriously impressed at how much those guys can throw shots continuously for minutes on end. Not my favorite format, but I understand what they're doing, right? So each attribute is highlighted in one or the other, right? So, and this is funny. So anyone who's competed in very organized events would know that there is a difference when you're fighting wake up style with the live stick and 10-point must system versus fighting in the first to 5 points system that is normally used in padded stick competitions. And here's the thing, I don't think there's a Filipino martial artist out there who would tell me that I'm lying if I say that a person who specializes in padded stick competition cannot transfer into live stick competition without any kind of adjustment, right? Like you can't just pick him up and plop him down here and have zero consequences, and he would perform the same way he would do in his padded stick competition. The same way a live stick competition fighter for Muay you cannot just pick him up and then drop him into a padded stick competition and have him dominate and do fantastically well. He has to adapt and adjust, and that takes a lot of training, right? So by extending that logic, if you take a Filipino martial artist, right, and then you plop him in an MMA competition, I don't think he will do that well. All right. Now, a lot of it is, of course, dependent on the skills of this particular person, the level of athleticism he has, right? We're talking about generalities here. If you take 100 Filipino martial artists and put them in 100 karate competitions, I don't think you're going to see a very high percentage of them succeeding. Um, and that's perfectly normal, because that's not what we train for. That's not what our unarmed combat is about, right? Now, someone has brought up very interestingly that Filipino martial artists can therefore adjust, right? So the same way a padded stick competitor can go into live stick and by just adjusting his training program, um, you know, by adding more endurance, focusing less on the distance and timing, um, changing up your routine and all of that. So if a padded stick competitor can adapt his program and then go into live stick, they're supposing that a Filipino martial artist with okay empty hands, right, with his unarmed training at a good level, right, can adapt his training and then go compete in MMA or whatever unarmed competition of choice. I've even heard claims for me as wild as winning in a submission sport, right? That for me is, ooh, that's a claim. That's a really big claim for me. Um, Now, I'm not saying it's impossible for a person to train Filipino martial arts and MMA. I mean, I know dozens of people who do the same thing. Like they train MMA and then they train Filipino martial arts, and they can be quite proficient in both. Right? I mean, you can have a genius who is like a triple black belt who's like a black belt in karate, judo, taekwondo, and then FMA, and then does MMA on the side. You can have these people. But one thing that this person cannot claim is when he fights in the ring, he cannot claim that it was his MMA or his FMA alone that made him win. The same way that he can't claim that, oh yeah, the reason why I win is because of my karate. My karate is like, my black belt in karate carried me throughout this thing. But people will say, hey, hold on, you have the BJJ black belt also. Didn't that help when the fight went on the ground? And he has to admit, like, yeah, of course, that helped at that point, right? So you can't claim the win exclusively for one art, right? That's what I'm saying. If you train too many martial arts, you cannot claim the victory for one martial art. Does that make sense? So if you adapt Filipino martial arts, I believe in order to be successful in any other format, you have to go and learn more than what Filipino martial arts is teaching. Like there's more to the more than what most Filipino martial arts curriculums are offering. Now, some people will tell me like, "Oh no, no, no! My Filipino martial arts has a very extensive, deep submission game." Do you? I don't want to be a jackass here, but a lot of people who claim that their FMA, like every time I've seen someone claim that their FMA has a deep submission game or ground game, it's one of two things. One, this person doesn't really know what how deep the ground game can go, so he thinks his ground game is good enough. Or two, they adapted so much stuff from the teacher adapted so much stuff from BJJ or judo or whatever, and then put it as and packaged it as part of his Filipino martial arts without telling his students like, hey guys, this is actually from BJJ. Like and I understand that. Like as a practitioner, if you find something that's useful, right, you take it, you teach it to your student, and say, hey, this is super useful. Learn this. That's martial arts, but you should be upfront with your students and tell them, actually, I got this from Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. It's a really great um, move or idea or strategy or technique that I got from BJJ. So I know some Filipino martial artists would just do BJJ stuff and repackage it as dumog or boltong or something, um, where it's not that at all, right? Um, yeah, it's weird. It's weird. Like for even if you look at our traditional grappling or traditional wrestling arts, like what they do in the mountain provinces, it's not a submission game actually. It's if I understand it correctly, I watched some of the videos. A lot of it is um, I call it the 3 point rule. A lot of people call it the 3 point rule, where if more than just your 2 feet are touching the ground, then you lose, right? Like if, of course, if you put me on my back, I lose, right? That's more than my 2 feet. But if you force your opponent to touch the floor, if you force your opponent to kneel, then that's more than 2 feet. I think that's that kind of wrestling game. And if you get super proficient in that, that's pretty good. Actually, there are lots of competitions in the world that are 3 point rule. But don't tell me that that kind of wrestling will prepare you for submissions. No, 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 no. I really don't think so. I really don't think so. Right? It's the same way that if someone goes out there and does double sticks, and then they say, "Oh, this has prepared me to use sword and shield," and like, did it? Did it? I'm not 100% sure about that. All right. Now, as always, I'm willing to be proven wrong. So if any of you guys have any ideas or any evidence that would tell me that, hey, you know what, my Filipino martial art has a very very deep tradition of submission wrestling um, that stretches back way way back, and it's definitely 100% documented. Like, oh my God, good job, right? At least that's something I'd love to learn, you know. Because if I had to do a submission game and there's a submission art in the Philippines that I could study, then yeah, I'd love to do that, right? But again, so far what I've seen is no, nobody really does that. Like again, most of it is repackaged judo, repackaged wrestling, like European style wrestling, repackaged something else, right? Not, I'm not saying though that there isn't a local, like if your teacher repackaged everything, but he did put in a little bit of flavor from local techniques, and we do have that in my martial art, like a little bit of local flavor, like some techniques and some visualizations that are very very different from other arts. That's great, but that's not the whole system, right? You still had to adapt. And it brings you to the problem of being in what they call, what some people would say the ship of Theseus problem, right? If you train so much to compete in an empty hand or an unarmed competition, you adapted your training so much so that your FMA will be competitive in an unarmed competition, right? You can start making your tappy tappies work, and you're making your what do you call that? You're defanging the snakes work, right? I'd love to see you guys make that work, and it can work. I've known people who can make it work, but not they're not. That's not the exclusive thing that they were using. But anyway, if you train it so much and adapt it so much so that you can actually win in an MMA fight or in a submission sport fight or in whatever unarmed fight you're in, then the question becomes is, are you still training Filipino martial arts? Like, again, it's the ship of Theseus problem, right? So for those who don't know, the ship of Theseus is this idea where the ship of the legendary hero Theseus was kept by this town, right? But throughout the years, since it's a ship made of wood, right, little bits of it would disintegrate, would burn, would catch fire, and there would be some accidents or whatever, and they had to replace certain parts. So at the end of 200 or 500 years, right, each part has been replaced by a new piece of wood, and none of the original pieces of wood from the ship was still there, right? Or something like 50% or something. So the question becomes: at what point does it become a new ship, right? So it was Theseus' ship, but they kept replacing parts of it, kept replacing parts of it. At what point in that timeline does that stop becoming Theseus' ship and it becomes something else, right? Now, philosophically, we can discuss that. Like the Japanese point of view is it was always Theseus' ship. Because they believe, like especially like the very Shinto mentality where objects have spirits, and the same way that if you become an amputee, it doesn't make you less of who you are because your spirit is the important part. But anyway, we can adapt that to martial arts, right? So some would say like, oh, no matter how much you adapt it, as long as you're coming from that lineage, it's still Filipino martial arts at the end, right? But some people would say, ho, 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 hold on. Some people would say, if 50% of your techniques and training and strategies and whatever is no longer Filipino martial arts, then you can't call it Filipino martial arts anymore. You can call it Filipino hybrid blend or something. Uh, that sounded worse than I intended it to be. Because there are people who use hybrid in their names, and I don't mean any disrespect. But yeah, and I actually love that you guys call it hybrid because that's being upfront with people. Like, yeah, yeah, this isn't pure Filipino martial arts. It's a hybrid of this and that, right? So, right, as you progress from this part, at what point are you turning into something else? Are you hybrid at this point? At this point, then do you become something else at this point? Right? So That's what I'm saying. But what is that for me? The moment you start changing, adapting it too much, you might not be able to. You might win, and you probably will if you're a good trainer. If you're a good athlete and you have a good trainer, you might win, but uh, you might not be able to claim that win for Filipino martial arts, right? That might be a win for something else. Okay, so that's just my idea about it, about training in uh, unarmed Filipino martial arts, and how it's different from how sorry self-defense is different from sport, and how we approach it a little differently, and why that approach might not make us the best uh, unarmed martial art out there. Okay. So guys, that's it for today. So keep training, and your panuntukans and whatever. I'm just a dude on the internet talking about martial arts. But if again, I'm always welcoming the feeling of being proven wrong, right? If you guys have evidence of your training and whatever, I'm open to hearing that. All right, so have a good day, guys, and talk to you in another video.